Hello, and welcome back to Wellywood Wargaming. My name is Damon, and I am back with another Necromunda video, this time looking at the 5 most beginner-friendly gangs in the game of Necromunda. Now, of course, these opinions and ideas are my own, so feel free to argue and disagree with me in the comments down below. And of course, do share, like, subscribe this video as well. But without further ado, we're going to get into it by looking at the 5 that I've picked for this particular video. 3 of them are house gangs, 2 of them are non-house gangs as well. So there are 3 house gangs that I've left out of this one, of course. See if you can already guess which ones they are. But of course, this video is really aimed at those players who are looking to get into the game or quite new to the game and beginners. Now, I would say before even watching this video that rule of cool is always the thing. So I would recommend that you play the gang that you like the look of the most and you like painting the most, things like that. But if you're not so bothered about that kind of stuff, then and you're looking at the mechanics and just the rules and stuff and learning things that way, then this video is absolutely for you. So without further ado, let's look at the number 1 in my list here, and that of course is House Goliath. Now, House Goliath, I would say overall are the most forgiving and easiest gang really to get to grips with in the game of Necromunda. You know, they're not without weaknesses. Every single gang has their own weaknesses, but House Goliath, I would say, overall are probably the strongest in the game, certainly for beginners anyway, and early on in campaigns too. Now, the 5 reasons that I've put down for this, first and foremost, I would say, is that Goliath are very, very tough. These guys are the big jacked up punks on steroids that we've had on the cover art of Necromunda N23. And the newer version of Necromunda as well. They were on the front cover of that too. And they really are and have been the poster boys for Necromunda since day one, really. So they're incredibly tough anyway. What that means is that your average fighter has toughness 4 instead of toughness 3. And that makes a considerable difference in how hard they are to wound. So what that means is, for those the uninitiated, I suppose, is most fighters in the game are strength 3, right? And most of the weapons in the game as well are also strength 3. So strength 3 wounding toughness 3 needs a 4+. So that's a 50-50 on a d6 roll of a dice. So that's 50-50 chance of wounding stuff. That's your most common sort of dice roll in terms of trying to wound stuff. Now, when you're trying to wound a Goliath and you're only strength 3 or you're using a strength 3 weapon, that goes to a 5-up. 5 or 6 needed on a d6 dice, which means that it's a 1 in 3 instead of a 50-50, which is considerably harder and, you know, much lower chance of wounding a Goliath fighter. Not to mention, to add to that, you've also got incredibly cheap furnace plate armor. I believe it's 5 credits for House Goliath, and that's a 5-up save from your front arc as well. So House Goliath, just to reiterate, are very, very tough indeed and hard to remove from the table generally. And certainly early on in a campaign too. The next thing that we need to look at with House Goliath is that they have a very high cool stat or a very low cool stat, depending on how you look at it. What that means is that your fighters are less likely to become broken, but also if they do bottle, should they bottle, and that's probably going to happen quite often, especially seeing as you have a low model count. We'll talk about that in a second. But House Goliath, very, very good cool, which means that generally once they have bottled, they're still going to stick around till the bitter end. And that's something that, again, is very forgiving for new players, I would say. Now, the other thing about House Goliath is they're very, very competent at melee. Indeed, they're one of the best melee gangs in the game, and they're also pretty good at shooting, to be honest, too. They're not bad at all. Most of the fighters have an average ballistic skill, which is pretty good. Your leaders and champs, have better ballistic skill as well. So they certainly can shoot. They're not just close combat brutes. And they've got some really, really good access to some very high damage output close combat and shooting weapons. The shooting weapons that I'm talking about are things like bolt guns, crack grenades on grenade launchers, heavy bolters even, combat shotguns. Some really, really good stuff there. And some of it's actually pretty cheap for House Goliath too. So that said, of course, they have got some really, really punchy melee stuff as well. I don't know how to say melee. Is it melee or melee? I'm not really sure. I'll mix up the two, I think. But yeah, very, very competent at sort of short to mid-range shooting and close combat as well, which means that they tend to dominate on most terrain types and most board sizes as well. Pretty strong against most opponents. The next thing as well is that they've got a small miniature count. What I mean by that is that your average fighter cost is quite high, which it does have its problems in a campaign if you're starting, because if you do happen to lose a fighter or a fighter dies, it does mean that it's quite hard to buy them back. But ignoring that for a second, having a low miniature count does mean that you have less physical miniatures due to them being quite expensive in the game. And that means that you've got less stuff to paint up, less stuff to carry around with you, and it's easier and cheaper to get into the hobby as well that way, needing usually just one box of fighters instead of two like you might need with House Cawdor. But we won't get into that at all. House Goliath are an elite gang, they're not a horde gang, so you're generally going to have less fighters with better equipment. The last thing we need to look at here is gene smithing. Now, gene smithing is the unique mechanic for House Goliath. Gene smithing is arguably the best of all the sort of house-specific special rules, I suppose. It can be really meta abused, I suppose, by certain types of people, but it's there to be abused as well. And if you're a new player getting into it, sure, give all your fighters +1 toughness if you really want to. Now, gene smithing does give you really, really good customization options, and also gives your fighters a bit more of a fluffy story as well. You can also nerf your fighters as well as giving them good stuff. You can actually nerf them and make them worse for less cost, which is pretty cool too. So very, very min-maxy. In fact, that's what gene smithing is. It's min-maxing. But if you're a new player getting into the game, that can be a little bit daunting at first, but you can keep it simple just by giving everybody blanket +1 toughness or something like that. Of course, that's disgusting, but you're forgiven because you're a new player. That's House Goliath anyway, and that's number 1 on my list, and those are some of the reasons why they're number 1 on my list. Number 2 on my list here is another house gang, and that's House Orloc. Now, House Orloc, I think, overall are the absolute best all-rounders in the game. What I mean by that is that they're sort of, and everybody says this is kind of a corny line, but they're like masters of nothing, I suppose. But they are a really, really excellent, fun game to play. Sure, they're a bit vanilla, but now that they've had a few upgrades to the gang since their house book, they have become a lot more fun as well, I would say, certainly with wreckers and doggos. But House Orloc, they're the bikies, the miners and bikies and working men of Necromunda. Pretty cool gang, and again, they've got very similar weapon choices to House Goliath as well. They might not have the high toughness stats, but they've got really excellent skill access. They've also got really good weapon choices as well. Most of those weapons being solid slug rounds. They don't tend to use energy weapons that much, but you still can get access to some plasma weapons and stuff too, just not much las. But what we're talking about here is shotguns, bolt guns, grenade launchers, auto guns, lots of rapid fire weapons. So these guys are good at putting out mid-range, short to mid-range rapid fire, lots of shots, high damage output, lots of templates too. Really, really solid shooty gang, but they can also mix it up in melee as well. Not quite as well as House Goliath though. The next thing to look at with House Orloc is that you've got something called legendary names. Now the legendary names, to put it really simply, is, well, it's the unique mechanic for House Orloc. And it keeps things super simple in that what it does, it gives your leaders and champs effectively another skill. So your leaders and champs already in Necromunda start with a skill that you can choose from one of the skill lists that they have access to. This gives you 2 skills instead of 1, which is fantastic, and some of them are exceptionally good. There's 1 or 2 actually in each legendary name list that you can add to your fighters who already get great access to ferocity skills and whatnot too. To make your fighters hard as absolute nails. So yeah, the legendary names, really, really easy to get your head around for a new player as well. The next thing is you've just got some unique sort of special pieces, I suppose, in the game. The Orloc leader has 3 wounds, which is just excellent. It's the highest amount of wounds on any fighter outside of maybe an Ogrin or something. Really, really good. 3 wounds on your leader is dramatically better than 2 wounds typical on your leader. Much, much harder to remove, particularly if you team it up with skills like True Grit, Unstoppable, Nerves of Steel, and of course some of the legendary names that make you even harder to kill. The other thing is you've got Arms Masters, which are excellent champions, really do provide sort of extra gang boons to your gang in terms of cool and things like that, making them much harder, much more rock steady, I suppose. And you've also got Wreckers and Doggos too. Wreckers are guys on jump packs who are just super, super fun and actually way kind of underrated, really. They're actually very good. They're probably the best prospects, or my favourite prospects in the game as well. But you've also got Doggos, Cyber Mastiffs that you can have. Now, Cyber Mastiffs, unfortunately, are costed far too expensive and they're just not very good for the price. But if you do like doggos in real life and you like little miniature versions of doggos as well, then by all means get some doggos and away you go. But very cool. Add a few different options to your gang as well there. The last thing that I'm going to talk about with House Orloc is that they are really easy to get hold of generally and quite cheap to get into as a gang. The reason being in that you get them in the core sort of Ash Wastes box. In fact, in that box you get 10 Orloc fighters. You also get some buggies as well that you can use for Ash Wastes too. These guys do have dedicated, in fact Goliath 2 have dedicated vehicles for Ash Wastes as well. But I'd say that the Orlocs are, you're going to find them on eBay quite a bit because of people buying Ash Wastes for just the terrain and then selling off the gangs, things like that. So that's another way to get into it. Or you might have the Ash Waste box set already, in which case you've already got an Orloc gang. So there you go. The last of the house gangs, because I'm only doing 3 here, is House of Ansar. Now, House of Ansar are very different to the other 2. They are the absolute shooty boys of Necromunda. And they're certainly not top of the sort of beginner gangs in the game, but they are very, very, very good indeed. Now, what I mean by shooty boys is that generally these guys have higher ballistic skill than the other 2 gangs, where Goliaths have the high toughness. These guys have the high ballistic skill, so they're very, very shooty. They're all energy and las weapons generally, which is pretty cool too. And they are just the best at shooting, pretty much. So if you want to keep people at arm's reach and just shoot them off the table, then House of Ansar is for you. They have excellent weapons and war gear in the shape of plasma guns, melter guns, rad weapons, just all sorts of cool shit, basically. However, on the flip side of that, they're not very comfortable at close range or close quarters in combat either. So you really do have to keep people at arm's reach, but we're not going to get into the specifics of that at the moment. The next thing is that you have bodysuits, armoured bodysuits or armoured undersuits baked into the cost of your fighters. So even though your fighters are very expensive for House of Ansar and very elite, similar to House Goliath, you do have some armour. You have a 6-up armour save, which comes on every single fighter. Stack that with mesh armour, and you've got suddenly a 4-up save, which is some of the best saves, or the best saves in the game from the box. So the bodysuits are definitely a big plus there as well. The next thing is if you've got really excellent prospects and juves. Not only are your juves ballistic skill 4, so that's the same as an average fighter from most other gangs, but they can also have basic weapons, meaning that you can give your juves las guns, which is just fantastic, because las guns are pretty much one of the best weapons in the game. You've also got brilliant prospects, even though I can't stand them. They're guys on surfboards. They are actually really, really good in the game and considerably tanky for a prospect as well, if I'm honest. So if you like the miniatures, get them. If you don't, maybe give your guys jetpacks or something instead to make them look a bit cooler. But guys on surfboards really aren't for me. And again, I suppose it is a blessing and a curse is that they do have a small miniature count, making them slightly cheaper to get into, less to paint, less to carry around, la-di-da, same as I said with House Goliath. However, that comes with its problems as well. Again, these guys are hard to replace if they do get killed in a campaign because they are very expensive in the game, and House Goliath are more forgiving in that regard and they're harder to kill. Ansar are a little bit easier to kill generally. However, if you do keep people at arm's reach, then you can just shoot everybody off the table. These guys excel in certain board types, so bigger boards with higher terrain, so you can be at better vantage points, things like that. Anything that has good lines of sight, of course, Ansar are going to dominate on. However, they won't dominate when it's all corners and dense terrain, and you are up against someone who's really good at close combat, for example, like corpse grinders, which leads me into the next one. Now, I haven't talked about Escher, Cawdor, or Delac because personally I don't think those 3 gangs are that beginner friendly. I mean, Escher could have been in here, but Delac and Cawdor, I don't think either of those gangs are particularly beginner friendly. The next 2 gangs, of course, are non-house gangs, and the first one is Corpse Grinders. Corpse Grinders are a bone of contention for many people, I suppose, but having done lots of thinking and my playing and my knowledge of the game evolving over the years since they've come out, I really enjoy Corpse Grinders. I think they're an excellent addition to the game, and I think I kind of begrudge anybody to talk badly about them these days. I actually really enjoy them being in campaigns, and I enjoy playing them too, and so should you. And if you're new to the game, I think Corpse Grinders are, again, one of the most forgiving and best gangs to start with, because they are actually relatively simple to play. They've only really got a few fighter types. They aren't that complex, but they've got some really good stuff about them. So firstly, they are the polar opposite of House of Ansar in that instead of being shooty boys, they are close combat boys. These guys are absolute close combat monsters, particularly your leader and your champions, but your gangers are pretty good too. And they will chop anybody up in melee or melee, whichever one it is, very, very easily indeed. So yeah, these are the close combat guys. If you like shooting, play Vansar. If you like close combat, then play Corpse Grinder Cult, basically. The next thing they've got going for them is incredibly undercosted and arguably too cheap initiates, which are pretty much your dues. Now, the stat line of the initiates is better than a Hive Scum, I think, and only 25 points. They come with armor, and they come with the infiltrate skill as well, which means that they can pretty much set up wherever they want on the board. Now, Corpse Grinders are pretty linear, I suppose, so having the ability to set up all your sort of forward scouts not only feels cool when you're playing them, but it can be pretty cheesy if you team that up with smoke grenades and hand flamers and things as well. So just don't be too corny with it, but do enjoy it because it's there to be enjoyed. Mass infiltration on your cheap fighters. So really, really cool, really, really fun, but very good indeed. You've also got masks and armor. So the Corpse Grinder masks that you get on your leaders and champs and gangers are all slightly different, but generally require a willpower check to be passed in order for the enemy to actually shoot you at all. Now, sometimes this gets house ruled in different groups in that it needs to be from a certain facing, things like that, or there might be certain things that are put in by an arbitrator to sort of nerf the use of the Corpse Grinder masks. But rules as written, they're pretty damn good, and they stop your fighters getting killed so much when you're trying to close that distance that you need to get into close combat range. You've also got some really good armor as well with plate mail and stuff, again, sort of baked into the cost of your fighters generally too. Skills and tactics are very, very good for Corpse Grinders too. The skills, in fact, are savagery skills, I believe they're called, are fantastic and really, really fun to use. And again, for beginners, not overly complex and nice and simple generally. You've also got some really good tactics cards there as well. And lastly, I think for Corpse Grinders is unique weapons. They've got lots of unique weapons, particularly the close combat stuff. In your paired heavy butcher's cleavers and stuff like that give you shit tons of attacks. So generally, whatever you hit in close combat, if you've got paired weapons specifically, you're just going to rip anything apart with your close combat weapons generally. So that's Corpse Grinders. Moving on to the last of my beginner-friendly gangs. The next one is going to be Palanite Enforcers. So both of these gangs, actually, your Enforcers and your Corpse Grinder cults, came in the second sort of box set that was released. Uprising was released for Necromunda a while back. That box set's actually quite hard to find now, but you may still get lucky on eBay and find these gangs going cheap. But Palanite Enforcers are the cops of Necromunda, and they've got some really unique strengths as well, which I would say also make them beginner-friendly in the game too. Firstly, they have excellent weapons at a cheaper cost generally too. So these guys, although their stats aren't particularly great, they do have better weapons than most people. Your bolt guns are cheaper and better because they have a 4-up ammo instead of a 6-up ammo, which suddenly makes bolt guns reliable as well as scary. You've also got Enforcer shotguns, which are combat shotguns. You've got some really, really good weapons as well. Concussion weapons. Concussion carbines are fantastic. You've got a unique sniper rifle with rending, which is excellent as well. And generally, all of your weapons are just fucking great. And not to mention the subjugator weapons as well, which is another thing entirely. But yeah, riot shields, grenade launchers, you name it, these guys have got it. They've got all the gears and relatively no ideas generally. The next thing that they've got going for them, though, is excellent armor. Arguably actually not quite as good as House Vansar when you want to do it that way, but these guys come with better armor out of the box in your layered flak and your hardened layered flak and your undersuits and whatnot too. They've also got magnicals, which are fun but not great in the game, to be honest. Good skills and tactics, again, very similar to your corpse grinders. These guys have very unique tactics cards and also very unique skills like Got Your Six, things like that, that are really fun to use, particularly for beginners in the game. Really nice and fluffy and fun skills and tactics that you can employ with these guys. The other thing that these guys have got going for them is they've got the best doggo in the game. I would say it's the best pet anyway, the Hardcase Cyber Mastiff. The rules for this guy can be found in the latest Aranthian Succession book, Vaults of Temenos, I believe, but also you'll find it online in places, I'm sure. But the doggo is brilliant. It's got toughness 4. It's just better. It's just much better than the Orloc doggo, to be honest. It's actually worth taking. So do that. They've also got unique brutes now and stuff too. And lastly, I think for the Palanites and Subjugators, the thing that's really they've got going for them is they're just cool as fuck. I mean, they just look great. I think so anyway. I think they're one of the best looking gangs in the game, particularly the Subjugators with the riot shields and whatnot. But yeah, Enforcers, they certainly have their weaknesses. I tend to find they're quite frustrating with the stats being not particularly great compared to a lot of other gangs, but their armor and their weapons will get you through early on in a campaign, and they're usually front runners in campaigns to perform the strongest against most different opponents, I would say. So anyway, those are the 5 gangs that I would say are the most beginner friendly. Now, I could have put Chaos Helots in there. I could have put a number of different gangs in there, some Venators perhaps, but I do feel that these 5 that I've picked here, for those reasons that I've just outlined, are probably the most easy to get to grips with, and just the easiest to get your head round as a new player as well, particularly House Goliath. I think House Goliath are the number 1 most beginner-friendly gang in the game. Now, please do comment down below if you disagree with that, or if you just have any comments that you'd like to add to that. I'd like to hear from you as well. I will catch you on the flip side. Peace out.